The beak has shown up more than once in the evolution of animal life, independently and in creatures that are wildly different. Turtles have beaks, some fish have beaks, cephalopods like octopuses and squid have them, so did some dinosaurs. And even the occasional kaiju has a beak, like Godzilla's enemy Gigan. But speaking of dinosaurs, as you probably know, birds are the only surviving dinosaurs. The common ancestor of all modern birds was a small dinosaur, and instead of a mouthful of sharp teeth, it had a beak. And FYI, when you're talking about birds, it's okay to say beak or bill. They're interchangeable, and I'll probably mostly say beak today. Despite any superficial resemblance to the beak of a turtle, let's say, the beak or bill of a bird is a unique anatomical feature. Along with feathers and behaviors like pooping on your freshly washed 2007 Kia Sorento, the beak is one of the defining traits of modern birds. Following that single common ancestor, the first bird with a beak, there was an evolutionary explosion of avian beak diversity that happened between about 65 and 80 million years ago. Most of the major beak shapes appeared in that time frame. Today, one of the most fascinating and wonderful things about birds is the diversity of their beaks. They come in all kinds of far-out shapes and sizes and colors, and a beak's shape is linked to what it does, how it functions. So a bird's beak can tell us a lot about how that bird lives. It seems likely that the beak was a helpful adaptation for flight in the first birds, because it's more lightweight than a tooth-filled set of jaws, and yet still very strong. And a beak is streamlined, aerodynamic. It's a marvel of natural engineering. So let's take a look at the anatomy of the beak from the inside out. At the deepest level are the bones of the skull. The ones most involved with the beak are, of course, those of the upper and lower jaws. In the upper jaw, we have several fused bones, including the maxillary and nasal bones at the base and the premaxillary bones toward the tip, what scientists would call the distal end. The premaxilla often makes up a significant chunk of the beak. The lower jaw is pretty much just a single bone, the mandible. Most of the movement we see in bird beaks is in the lower jaw. That's how human skulls work too, right? When we flap our jaws like I'm doing right now, it's only the lower one that moves. But many birds can also independently move their upper jaw. That ability is called cranial kinesis. In this scarlet macaw skull, for example, you can see how the upper jaw lifts up, rotating from the point where it meets the skull. This is called the craniofacial hinge. Cranial kinesis gives the bird more dexterity with its beak, and it can open its jaws wider to grab large fruits or seeds or whatever. Another type of cranial kinesis that we see in some birds is rhynchokinesis. This is where a bird, like this common snipe, can open up just the tip of its upper jaw. Rhynchokinesis allows birds like this to probe into mud or sand to snatch up small animals like worms and crustaceans. And a beak with rhynchokinesis doubles as a great trash grabber. So that's the skull. Moving outward from the bone, we have a couple layers of tissue, the dermis and the epidermis. The dermis contains connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. It provides structural support to the overlying epidermis and supplies nutrients and oxygen necessary for the health and maintenance of the hard outermost layer. The cells of the epidermis produce that hard covering of the beak, the surface that we see. That's called the rhamphotheca. It forms a sort of sheath around all the other layers of the beak. The rhamphotheca is made of a tough substance called keratin. You know, like what your fingernails and hair are made of. But the keratin of bird beaks, feathers, and claws is even tougher. Most birds have a dry, hard rhamphotheca. It's got a texture sort of like polished wood or like plastic. But some birds, like ducks and geese, have a softer, more flexible rhamphotheca. Duckbills have a texture that's sort of rubbery. We can look more closely at the rhamphotheca and identify its various parts. The culmen is the dorsal ridge running along the top midline of the upper mandible. The cere is a fleshy, often waxy area at the base of the upper mandible, near the nostrils, or nares. Not all birds have a cere, but it's common in parrots, raptors, and pigeons. The tomium refers to the cutting edge of the beak, found on both the upper and lower mandibles. It's often sharp and sometimes serrated, helping birds cut through food, such as cracking seeds or slicing through flesh. Usually not human flesh, but you never know. The gonus is the central lower ridge of the lower mandible, extending from the tip of the beak to where the two halves of the mandible join. The premaxillary nail, also known as just the nail, is the hardened tip at the very end of the upper mandible. The nail works sort of like a fingernail, or a claw at the tip of a finger. A bird uses it for things like poking around in the mud and manipulating food items. When birds gained the ability to fly, they lost the ability to grab things with their clawed hands. So instead, birds have to use their beaks, in combination with their feet, to interact with the world. The beak is sort of like a single hand. The general shape of a bird's beak can tell us a lot about its associated feeding strategy. Feeding is the most important function of the beak. Most birds fit into one of the following broad categories. Starting with insect catching, we've got an illustration at the top showing the generalized beak shape for this feeding strategy. Below that are some examples of birds that fit into this category. Let's listen to some music as we check out these different beak shapes. Cool. So then we have some birds with relatively bizarre beaks. These species tend to have specialized diets or specialized foraging techniques. For example, skimmers have an oversized lower mandible. Here's a flock of black skimmers. Check out those crazy lower mandibles. A skimmer flies low over water with its knife-like lower jaw slicing through the surface. When it hits a fish, the jaws snap shut reflexively. But no fish this time. Try again, little buddy! Other specialized beaks include those of pelicans, spoonbills, and flamingos. Flamingos are filter feeders that eat tiny things in salty water. Cyanobacteria, diatoms, brine shrimp, and so on. They feed by dipping their heads underwater in an upside-down position. They keep the top of the beak, their upper jaw, close to or pressed against the bottom. That's why a flamingo's beak has that odd, kinked shape. While feeding, the beak is perfectly positioned to be parallel with the bottom substrate. Another group of birds with weird beaks are the 6 species of crossbill, all in the genus Loxia. The bones of the upper and lower jaws in these specialized finches are offset to the left and right. This arrangement allows a crossbill to pry open the scales of cones on a coniferous tree to get at the tasty seeds inside. Like this guy here. So that was feeding. What are some of the other functions of bird beaks? Well, there's fighting. That's an important one. Birds use their beaks as weapons to defend their territories, to protect themselves from predators, and to defend their chicks. You know how Canada geese will get all aggro and defend their fuzzy babies by chasing and biting people in a parking lot? Birds also use their beaks for grooming their feathers. This is how they keep their feathers tidy and in good shape, and how they remove dirt and parasites from their plumage. After a meal, a bird will often rub its beak on a tree branch or a rock. This behavior, called feeking, helps to keep the beak clean. Because a bird doesn't want to rub its filthy face on its feathers. Then the feathers would get all gunked up, right? Feeking is like dabbing the corner of your beak with a napkin after you gorge yourself on an entire tray of lasagna. Hey there. Are you liking this video? Are you liking it? Because if you're liking it, you might want to make it official, right? Consider subscribing because it's all birds, all science, all the time, and I suspect that's what you're looking for, so subscribe. Because the beak works like a hand, it's a super useful tool for building a nest. For example, weavers, birds in the family Ploseidae, are able to tie complex knots and make intricate weaving patterns to build their nests, using their beaks and their feet. Some birds also use their beaks to regulate their body temperature. Remember that there's a layer of blood vessels and nerves beneath the rhamphotheca, in the dermis and the epidermis. The more blood that flows through those vessels, the more heat that can be released from a bird's body. A great example is the toco toucan, Rhamphastos toco. This species has one of the largest beaks of any bird relative to its body size. I mean, look at that thing. It's totally out of control. But it's also great for plucking large fruits in the open woodlands of tropical South America. Well, research on the toco toucan has shown that this bird also uses that sizable beak as a sort of radiator. When the toucan gets too hot, increased blood flow to its beak allows heat to radiate away from its body. The last major function of beaks that I'll mention today is communication. Birds don't have lips to manipulate the sounds coming out of their windpipes, the way we do. But they can still open and close their beaks as they sing to produce different sounds. For example, here's a cute little Eurasian wren singing his heart out while flapping his tiny jaws. Some birds communicate with each other by making noises with just the beak. In other words, without any vocalization. This white stork is showing a behavior called bill clapping. Bonded pairs of breeding birds will often rub their beaks together. For example, look at these Atlantic puffins nuzzling each other. This adorable situation, this behavior is called billing. I guess if you ain't got lips, this is as close as you're gonna get to kissing, right? Now, as for communication, puffins, toucans, and quite a few other types of birds have brightly colored beaks. These colors can be a signal for attracting a mate, or a way for birds of the same species to recognize each other at a distance. You can see how the bird beak, the bill, works like a sort of multi-tool. This unique anatomical structure comes in a wild diversity of shapes and colors. And these features are directly related to the functions of the beak: feeding, fighting, grooming, nest building, temperature regulation, and communication. So hopefully you now know a bit more about the structure and function of beaks. Thanks for learning about birds with me today, and I'll catch you next time. Whoa. Man, that thing's like choking on plastic fumes.